Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon to you all viewers across the world, and welcome back to another exclusive edition of Global Arena on our YouTube channel, Global Arena TV. I'm Maryam Saleh Adamu, a level 200 student of Mass Communication at Bayer University, Kano, together with my co-hosts Umar Isa Endabu and Aisha Rufai Ijiga. On today's episode, an adventure like no other with Mrs. Yvonne Ridley, who is a British freelance journalist, author, and a politician. She was the chief reporter of the Sunday Express and had worked for several newspapers, including the Sunday Times, the Independent, and the Observer. And also, while working as a journalist, she found herself in a life-threatening situation when she was captured by the Taliban in Afghanistan, which made her discover her fate. Once again, let's welcome Ms. Yvonne Ridley.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Mariam.
Yeah, thank you very much for being with us. Once again, ma'am, I am delighted to connect you to my co-presenters, Aisha and Mariam, and they're going to lead the interview like I told you earlier before we started recording. They're going to be asking you the questions about your motivation in journalism and so on and so forth, the journey so far, the achievements, the challenges, and so on and so forth. So, Aisha Jiga.
Okay, ma'am. What initially inspired you to pursue a career in journalism?
Well, I was about 13, 14 at the time, and I was reading the work of a great journalist called Robert Fisk, who has sadly passed on now. And he had written about a massacre that he had come across in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon, which was in a Palestinian refugee camp. And his words moved me to tears. And I just thought that, I didn't want to make people cry, but I just thought that if words can be so powerful, this is an area that I would like to be involved in. And then I wrote a letter to my local newspaper, which was published, and a lot of my friends had read it and contacted me and congratulated me for getting a letter published. And the feeling from that, again, the power of words and the reaction to them made me realize that if used in the right way, then words can be extremely powerful. So I decided that this is what I want to do. I want to be a journalist. I was only 18. I didn't go to university, which in hindsight, I think that I should have, just for the rounded experience more than the qualifications. And so I went straight into journalism from school. And I have to say, I am in my 60s now, and I just do not feel as though I've started working yet. Because you get people who are in jobs who are forever looking at their watches thinking, I just want to get home. I'm looking forward to the weekend. And I have never felt like that about this job. I've never tired of it. Every day is something different. Every day is a new challenge. And you have no social life. I have about 3 or 4 broken marriages. So I'm not a great advert for a great private or family life. But this job, if you get into the right conditions, can be so rewarding.
I'm sorry to cut you off or to chip in here. You said you've had 3 broken marriages. Is it like because you've been a journalist throughout your life, all your life, that made you get into that position? Like journalism has cost you your marriages?
Well, they were bad matches anyway, looking back. But I would say that my career accelerated the demise of my marriages, and because I was so involved in getting the story and wanting the story, that, you know, looking back, I missed weddings, funerals, births, all sorts of key events, and I was just really welded to the job.
Yeah, that's cool. Maybe later, much later, I will ask you a question, or one of them will ask you a question about the challenges of marrying a practicing journalist. Yeah.
So when I was reading one of your articles, I learned that you worked in Study News. Probably it was the first place you worked, right? So what was your experience there? What was the best part in working there?
Well, as I said before, every day is different. And so you walk in not quite knowing what to expect. I think in journalism, you meet people at their best, sometimes at their worst. You know, you're meeting people in extreme situations where they have done something incredible under amazing duress. I used to be a showbiz writer, but I have to say that the most rewarding stories that I have done haven't been with celebrities. They've been with ordinary people who've done extraordinary things.
Okay, Mom, what are those challenges that you faced as a journalist?
Well, the challenges have changed over the years. The first challenge I felt that I was facing as a young journalist was because I was a female in a very male-dominated environment. And that was difficult to overcome because when major stories were breaking, like murders, serious crime, wars, conflicts, humanitarian disasters, the men in the office would always be prioritized and they would be sent out. Whereas the stories that are perceived to be softer, more feature orientated, the women tended to get those stories. It has changed now. And I think it's changed for the better because when women go into war zones, they have a different range of priorities and they tend to humanize the situation. Whereas I'm sure you've heard the expression boys with toys. You'll get a male journalist going on saying, oh, this F-16 fighter jet with X number of rapid rounds of ammunition and all of, you know, all the detail about the weaponry and systems comes to the fore, where a woman will go into a war zone and say, I met this mother who was struggling with her young baby and she's lost her home and she's trying to cook on this tiny stove. And then you suddenly get a much more human perspective. Of course, we shouldn't generalize, but that was definitely one of the challenges. The challenge I'm facing now as a journalist is my age. And there is a lot of ageism out there. And that can be quite frustrating as well. In academia, wisdom is often measured in years, but in journalism, it's seen very much as a young, fit, active person's job, and not some doddery old trout like me.
In your book, In the Hands of Taliban, where you were captive for 11 days there, where you spent 11 days there. So during that 11 days, was there any day that you felt like quitting journalism when you were in the prison or when you come out? Have you ever, for a moment, considered leaving journalism? Because in one way or the other, journalism led you to be in that prison. So in one way or the other, have you ever felt like leaving journalism when you come out, or even before you come out? And what really inspired you to continue that field after all the difficulties you encountered?
Well, the first thing that I did when I had been captured and taken into prison, I was given a pencil and told to write down who I was, addresses, contact numbers, anything that would prove that I was a journalist, which I duly did, and I wrote it all down. And then they took me to my cell, and I managed to keep the pencil. So I thought, great, I'm back in business. You know, at least I've got a pencil. Now I just need something to write, some paper or something. And later that day, they supplied me with a toothbrush and toothpaste. And the toothpaste was a brand new tube in a box. And I carefully unpicked the box and flattened it out. And I thought, right, now I am truly back in business because I've got something to write with and I have a piece of cardboard to write on. And so using minute writing, I started to keep a diary and to make notes of my surroundings. And although it was a terrifying experience, again, the job kept me sane because I just thought, if I ever get out of this hellhole, I'll be able to write a really good story. And so that's why I was making notes all the time.
So quitting journalism was not an option?
It was instinctive. One of the most frustrating things, Mariam, was when the war started and 3,000 journalists had assembled on the Pakistan border waiting for the war to start with Afghanistan. And the war started.
Thank you.
And I was the only Western journalist who was in Afghanistan, and I couldn't report on the start of the war. And that was incredibly frustrating because I had an international exclusive, but no audience to relay it to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're talking about your stay with the Taliban. That was an international issue, of course, that needed the attention of the world, but then no audience to relay to. So what happened when you came out of captivity? When they took you, you said that in your book, the Taliban treated you with quote unquote courtesy and respect. They are not even making or maintaining an eye contact with you, let alone touching you or causing any harm to you.
Well, I didn't realize up until then that telling the truth had become such a rebellious act, but nobody wanted to hear. anything good about the Taliban. So when I came out and said I was treated with courtesy and respect, there was universal outrage. You know, this was the most brutal, evil regime in the world. And you've come out and you have the nerve to tell us that you've been treated with courtesy and respect. And all I could say is, well, do you want the truth or don't you? And it was, I've never been forgiven for telling the truth. And even today, people get annoyed when I say I was treated with courtesy and respect, but it was the truth.
But some people were thinking like you came down with what they called Stockholm syndrome, right?
Yes.
That is falling in love with your captive. I mean, captor, right? Rather, somebody that kidnaps you.
I think it's sort of more developing a bond with them than falling in love with them. Because I would say between myself and my captors, it was mutual hatred. It was a real clash of culture. They just thought that, well, I had adopted the risky strategy of being the prisoner from hell. And so I was rude to them. I was abusive. I threw things at them. I spat at them. I cursed them. As I went on hunger strike, I refused to cooperate with them. And I think that they just thought, well, we knew Western women were bad, but my God, they're far worse than we could have imagined. You know, she's a nightmare. And it was, so I do smile when people say, oh, yes, she suffers from Stockholm syndrome, because to do that, you have to bond with your captors. And I think it can happen in a relatively short time, but I don't think it can happen in 11 days. And the first part, I was held for 6 days by one group and then handed over to another group for the remaining. As I said, you know, I've not been forgiven even today for saying that they had treated me with courtesy and respect, but that was the truth, and nothing to do with Stockholm syndrome.
All right.
Okay. Mom, in journalism, we have these principles and considerations that we need to consider while reporting. What do you think are those ethical considerations that a journalist must consider while reporting news?
We must strive to be impartial. But at the same time, there are occasions where we should give a voice to the voiceless and try and help the oppressed. I think it was the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu who said that if an elephant is standing with its foot on a mouse's tail, the mouse will not appreciate your impartiality. And it's true. You know, he was a very wise man. And that was a brilliant example. So if a journalist is going into a prisoner of war camp, he or she will want to speak to the inmates and find out about their plight rather than speak to the guards or the commandant of that camp. It's a bit like in a rape trial. You would give more coverage towards the rape victim rather than her attacker. But unfortunately, in the world today, especially over the coverage in Gaza, it is unimaginable the sort of nonsense that is coming from the mainstream media today. And we see it in the headline writers. There is absolutely no impartiality at all. The reporting is very much on the side of Israel, and no thought at all is given towards the Palestinians. Just a couple of nights ago, two 2,000-pound in weight bunker busting bombs were dropped on a refugee camp. And following the carnage, babies were decapitated, beheaded. And this was not covered in the mainstream media. And yet the fake stories that were manufactured around October the 7th were front page news, unchallenged, and just accepted and repeated. 40 children were beheaded. And that was a fake story. And all of the mainstream media ran with it, and not one apologized for misleading the reader. So there is a disparity in the coverage of Palestine and Israel. The Palestinians are often portrayed as the aggressor, and the Israelis are often portrayed as reacting to some form of aggression that has been perpetrated against them. It's quite astonishing.
So my next question is going to be related to what you just said. So it's about, what is the role of journalists? What is the role they play in the society? You see, some say journalists are just storytellers. They create stories just to spread, while some say they are reporters, which I think we are, because we report what we see. But from your point of view, what do you think?
Every story that you write should answer who, what, why, where, and when, and how. And if you can answer all of those questions in your story and write factually and let the reader decide. You see, for a lot of people, the beginning of this war in Gaza was October the 7th, 2023, when in fact the story goes back to 1922, when the British Foreign Minister gave away a piece of land in the Middle East, which did not belong to him, and he gave it away to another group of people without consulting the original people on the land. That's when the trouble began. And that's how far, 75 years of injustice against the Palestinians. And that's when the story started. But if you did that, you'd probably send your reader to sleep. So it's very difficult to be able to convey a message without loading one side or the other.
So now journalism has become more complicated than it was before, right?
Well, it shouldn't be complicated. Telling the truth should be a very simple thing to do, but it's not. And, you think about your own sort of private life. You go to a friend's house, you have something to eat. It might be burnt, it might not be tasty at all. But if they turn around and say to you, did you enjoy your dinner? You're not going to say, actually, I didn't. It was awful.
Yeah.
You're going to smile and say, yes, it was wonderful. Thank you. It is very difficult to tell the truth. It's like the old story of the woman putting a dress on. Does my bum look big in this? Nobody is going to say, oh, yes, you look a bit on the heavy side. So telling the truth is or can be very tough at times.
Yeah, definitely.
It can also be quite dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. But then one thing I'm interested in, I'm interested in terms of telling the truth, and the truth, the different types of truths that we're in search of, we're in quest of, is the fact that what may be truth, or what is truth, or what is defined as the truth in Africa may not be the type of truth that the Western people define. For example, to the Americans, the Russians are aggressors. Russians are not good people, for example, especially the Kremlin. And for the Western, for the Russians, the Americans are aggressive. They are the aggressors. Wherever they go into, they leave a great deal of devastation. Iraq is an example, Syria, and the rest, for example. And the Chinese also have their own version of the truth. So what I'm confused about is, what is the universal truth now?
Well, it's, if I hold this up to you and say, you know, what is this? And you'll say it's a cup, and I'll ask you to describe it. You know, you will describe what you see. You won't mention the handle because you can't see it. So it can be a very difficult process to try and cover an event, especially for journalists who are embedded with an army, because they only get one slice of what's actually happening from the perspective of the soldiers. The odd Western journalist that has been allowed into Gaza under the control of the Israeli military has been told, you can come in, but you can't speak to any Palestinians. Well, what's the point in that? You know, it's very frustrating that you can't speak to all parties. So the truth is, you know, it can very often be disputed. One thing that is for sure, you can't drop bombs on nice people. So if the Russians are portrayed as bad and evil and enemies of America, then it's more easy for Americans to watch the news and say, well, you know, those Russians have never liked us anyway, so if we're bombing them, we're bombing them. But then again, when the full horrors of the Vietnam War, which I think was the first properly televised war in the West, when those shocking images were brought home to the Americans, they were just like, oh my God, you know, we had no idea this is what happens in war. And the images of the young girl who was running naked with her skin peeling off after she'd been attacked with this Agent Orange was an iconic image which haunted people for many years to come. And, you know, they just said, bring the soldiers home. And so, because of the pivotal role journalists play in war, the armies are fighting two battles. They're fighting one against the enemy, but they're also fighting a battle at home, trying to win people's hearts and minds and to maintain the support. Now, for some bizarre reason, Israel doesn't seem to care what the rest of the world thinks. And so we have seen these atrocities very often filmed by their own soldiers of war crimes. And I'm sure, they're called the TikTok army. And I'm sure that their videos will be used in evidence against them should the International Court of Justice ever bring Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant to trial. So we're seeing a lot of double standards. And one of the biggest criticisms of the ICC and the ICJ is it was only ever there to target Black African leaders, and it left the rest of the world alone. Of course, now it's answering its critics thanks to heroic countries like South Africa who have demanded that justice be done.
As journalists, we don't have the right to state our opinions or our emotions. So how do you approach telling stories that are sensitive and controversial in nature? And then how you handle criticism that may arise from such stories?
It can be quite difficult because I've only seen it happen 2 or 3 times where a journalist has completely had a meltdown in front of the camera. And on all the occasions that I've seen it, it's been very powerful. But I think you can only get away with it once. And we are supposed to be impartial. I think that is, in some circumstances, that is unreasonable because you can quite clearly see who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And again, going back to this war in Gaza, the global South must look upon the West as being a really evil entity for allowing Israel to carry out an attack on women and children, which it has done. Virtually every day there is a new atrocity that is coming to our attention. And yet the Americans are saying, oh, we're going to keep on supplying arms, we're going to keep on supplying weapons. And there will be government lawyers who are very nervous about this, especially now that the ICC and the ICJ are looking very closely at the way Israel is conducting itself. And as I say, there is a double standards there, because if they were investigating an African country, the West would be saying, oh, well, we must have justice. But because it's investigating Israel and all the emotional baggage attached to Israel, which shamelessly weaponizes the Holocaust, of course, the people in the global South will be disgusted with the attitude of the US president. You know, America is at the moment the only superpower in the world today. People look up to America for guidance, for good governance, for an international policeman. And at the moment, it is not fulfilling that remit at all. So these are very difficult times to be a journalist. In fact, I think it's probably easier from your perspective to cover what is happening in Gaza than it is for some Western journalists who are working for publishers who will not allow any writing in the negative against Israel. And Israel's journalists were regarded as a fairly free media, but since October the 7th, they have been self-censoring themselves. And the images that we are seeing on the social networks are not being shown in Israel. All they're seeing are interviews with the families of the hostages.
Yeah. Right.
So, with all the journalism industry you have worked with, if there was one thing you could change about them or about the career in general, what would it be? Maybe the way people say things about journalists or something. What would it be?
It's very difficult because people are polarized at the moment. And in America, for instance, you have the presidential elections coming up, and you've got President Donald Trump, who is absolutely shameless in his bad behavior and conduct and sees nothing wrong in calling for Hillary Clinton to be locked up. And he'll start chanting, lock her up, and everybody joins in. And though his supporters, and there's about 5 million barking mad Trump supporters out there, and if you try and tell them that their beloved leader is a bit insane, they will go crazy. They won't believe you. They won't want to read it. They'll switch off. You'll lose viewers. You'll lose readers. No Trump supporter watches CNN anymore. But then again, CNN is getting a whole raft of new viewers who want to hear all the bad things about President Trump and what he's been up to. So it's, again, from a commercial point of view, telling the truth could end up bankrupting you. There was a famous jeweler in Britain called Gerald Ratner, and he sold his jewelry at amazingly low prices, and people couldn't understand how they could buy gold so cheaply. And he did an interview one day and he laughed and he said, "My jewelry is crap, but it's making me very rich." And his customers were furious at this confession, this admission. And so they stopped shopping in his shops, and he went out of business very soon afterwards. So, you know, telling the truth isn't such a good idea at times. You have to work out your audience.
Okay, Mom, are there any lessons you learned from your journalism journey that you wish you knew before starting out? When starting out?
Journalism is fraught at the moment because of fake news, and I have a feeling that it's going to become much more challenging for your generation because of artificial intelligence. And, you know, we've already had situations where people have been seen saying something and it's been a fake image, and it hasn't happened. And it's been artificial intelligence. And that, just throw that into the mix, and it makes your job so much more difficult to try and work out, is this a real person? Is it artificial intelligence? Is the person really saying that? I mean, these artificial intelligence machines are really very, very clever now. The technology is superb.
Yeah. And are you trying to say that artificial intelligence is now a threat to journalism?
It could be. It could be in the same way that citizen journalism could be a threat to journalism. I happen to think that citizen journalism is very good because it means that areas that are neglected by the media, everybody's got a smartphone these days and they can capture that George Floyd moment. Mm-hmm. And so citizen journalists do a good job on the whole, but there are a few who also distort the truth. So again, it's down to the journalists to check their sources, recheck them, and recheck them again. And I'm sure that artificial intelligence can be used for the good, but the possibilities make me think, I'm getting too old for this business.
Yeah, we have like less than 5 minutes to go. If we can briefly ask 3 questions. I have one important question for you, and then each one of them will ask you one question, and then we'll wrap it up. The question I have for you is, how significant is following the news in improving one's English language?
It's essential. I would say it's essential that you watch the news. I drive my husband buggy. The first thing that I do when I wake up is I put on the TV news. Then I put on a political program that I listen to every morning. So I've got the TV news coming in with breaking news and ticker tape going round and round, and constant interruptions. And then I've got this political program that I listen to that gives me a sense of what the news agenda is going to be for that day. And my husband is a typical man. He can't multi-skill. So it's driving him crazy seeing the news one minute, hearing the news the next, and he has to escape just to get out. But, I'm watching the news, I'm listening to it, and it's very important to get a sense of what is happening in the world.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
That is important.
Yeah, specifically for our English students, what roles does news play or does following the media play in improving their English language as English learners?
Well, I would say if you're learning English as a foreign language, I would think that listening to the news is essential. But I know people who go and watch movies and pick up language that way. It's once you hear and see language in action, it can only help in your knowledge of it. And English is an international language. I think Spanish might be another rival. I think there are more Spanish speakers now in America than there are English. So, but being able to communicate in different languages is really a wonderful thing. I don't speak any other languages. I only speak English, and unfortunately, that's sort of typical. And this was shown when I was captured by the Taliban. I expected them to get me someone who would speak English rather than me try and communicate in Pashto.
Okay, the last question from my side. So what's the most, in all the stories you have reported, what's the most memorable story you can remember that it's been months, years, and you still hold up to that story? You like the story?
the most memorable story that caused the biggest pain in government was a cleaner who told me her son was in Germany with his British Army regiment, and the Gulf War was going on, and she said he was really furious because the British government didn't have enough tanks that worked, and so they cannibalized his tank for spare parts. And that made me realize just how desperately underfunded the British Army was. And this story just came by having a casual encounter and cup of coffee with a cleaner whose son happened to, he'd written a letter to his mother complaining. And she gave me this information. And that story went headlines all around Britain about the tin pot army that we had that was breaking up and broken down, and it beat all the defence journalists, and it was headline news, and the government had to make statements. And it was the origin of the story, really, that it came from this lovely, humble woman. And this is important to remember as a journalist: listen to everybody. Never be too busy. Listen to everything everybody has to say. Andy Warhol said, for 15 minutes at least in someone's lifetime, they will be famous. So everybody has it in them to create a headline. So always listen to the little person as well as the person with the microphone.
Yes.
Okay, what is that one rewarding moment and achievement in your journalism career that stands out to you?
What moment stands out?
Yes, an achievement.
Yeah. I think it was an undercover story that I was doing. And I was seeing if I could hire, it was when the old Queen was alive, and it was seeing if I could hire the Queen's guards for private bodyguard work. And I posed as a dodgy businesswoman, and I hired the Queen's guards. They were in Buckingham Palace one day, and then I had them for a full day going around London on nefarious business activities the next day, and we got photographs of them. And that was quite astonishing that you could hire the Queen's bodyguards as your own bodyguards. They were all reprimanded the next day when the story came out, but it was quite interesting.
You became the face of the front pages at that time?
Yes. Yes, it was an interesting sting, and it was quite nice because my persona was a very wealthy businesswoman, so I had my own chauffeur-driven car, and I was going to the best hotels and restaurants just to keep up appearances. So it was good fun.
But in a sentence, what was the motive? What was the wisdom behind that story? What did you want to achieve?
What I wanted to achieve was to show how poorly paid the armed forces were, and that they were doing jobs on the side to supplement their wages.
Wow, that's cool. And it was effective? Your expose was effective?
Well, it wasn't for the men because they were all reprimanded, and I don't recall the armed forces getting any sizable increase in their wage packets. So,
Sure.
that would have been a success if they'd got a great big pay rise, but they didn't.
But at the same time, you are the cause of those guys being reprimanded, possibly kicked away from their jobs.
I did contact them after the story was published and apologized to them and took them out for a drink afterwards to show that there was no hard feelings, and they were fine.
And they forgave you for that? For what?
Yes, and that's an important lesson to learn. Try not to make enemies, because you never know when you'll have to go back to your source for a story.
Said you have written many books, 7, right?
Oh, yes, I wrote a book about my experience with the Taliban. I also wrote a book on torture, asking if it works as a weapon of war, which it doesn't. And I wrote a book about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But the way I wrote that one was from the perspective of his enemies. And he had a great deal of admiration from his enemies, people who were on the opposite side or critical of Islam were actually in awe and wonderment of him. So that was quite an interesting exercise. And I've written books to do with the war in Iraq, and or chapters in books of that. And I've written 2 fictional books. I'm trying to find a publisher for one, but it can be quite difficult. The publishing industry is probably the toughest industry to get into these days. Sorry, I'm a bit hard of hearing, and that's because when I was in Syria a couple of years ago, I was sitting having a meal when ISIS or Daesh sent a mortar bomb over. And one of the risks of working in a war zone, of course, is being shot at or fired at. And this mortar bomb landed about 5 yards away from me, but it was behind a wall. So the wall soaked up the impact of the bomb, but the sound has left me with a bit of tinnitus, and I'm a little bit deaf. So
yeah, sorry. So sorry to hear about this horrible experience.
So do forgive me for that. But that's something else that, I was talking about Gaza. We've lost an unprecedented amount of journalists whose only job was to report the truth, and they have paid the blood price for it. So always make sure that when you're out reporting that you do have ear defenders, that you've got a helmet, that you've got bulletproof vests, and you might feel awkward, but it could save your life. So always try and make sure that you have the right equipment.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. Thank you very much indeed.
And what advice do you have for us, Mom? Like, all of us want to grow up and be like you. So what advice do you have for us?
Be fearless, but don't be reckless. If you're dead, you can't tell the story. So, but, just be brave, be authentic, be fearless, and be truthful where you can. And, in our great faith, delivering the haqq or the truth is a great honor. It's a noble profession. And, just do the best you can. Whatever you're reporting, whether it's, I spent the first few years of my life reporting on craft fairs, who made the best cake, who made the best jam, who won the prize for getting the most objects into a matchbox. And all that taught me was accuracy. You must get people's names right. Never be afraid to ask somebody, how do I spell your name? And that's something that I have noticed, that in Britain, people like to have their names spelled correctly, whereas in the Muslim world, people aren't that hung up on whether there's an E at the end of their name or not. They're very sort of, oh, it doesn't matter, but it does. So in try and be accurate, which is another way of telling the truth, but a much safer way as well.
Sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the last question from my side is actually not related to this, but in your book, In the Hands of Taliban, I read that you wore a burqa when you were in Afghanistan. So how did it feel the first time you wore a burqa?
The burqa, I had a love-hate relationship with the burqa. It was very claustrophobic and very hot. And it took a while to be able to maneuver around it, and to have my eyes sort of covered by this material. That was quite difficult. But the burqa was also a fantastic garment for an investigative journalist, because nobody takes any notice of you wearing a burqa. And you can move around fairly anonymously and nobody will bother you. And it's also a great leveler, because nobody's looking at your figure. You're not being judged on the size of your waist or any part of your body. It is a great leveler, but it is a very restrictive garment as well. So, as I say, my relationship with the burqa was very much a love-hate one. And I did interview a burqa seller in Kabul, and I said to him, "Oh, you must be so..." When I interviewed him, the Taliban had been routed and were out of power, and it was about 2002. And I said, "You must be so sad now that the Taliban has gone, because nobody will want to buy your burqa." And through a translator, he said to me, "I am the 5th generation of burqa sellers in Kabul, and the burqa has been around for centuries. It's not something new that the Taliban introduced. It's a cultural garment that is worn by Afghan women." And he said 30, 40 years ago, so that's long before the Taliban were on the scene, women used to wear burqa trousers. So they would have these great big pantaloons that they would pull on first, and then they would put on the burqa. as well. So they were totally covered. But the practical reason for the burqa is parts of Afghanistan are incredibly dusty places, and it's that very fine dust that gets everywhere. And so the burqa is an excellent garment for keeping your real clothes clean. So it has a variety of purposes. But as I say, the burqa, often associated with the Taliban, has been around for centuries.
Great.
So thank you so much for having us. Thank you for the answers, and thank you for everything. And thank you for honoring our invite. Aisha is not here, so on behalf of her, I and Umar, thank you so much for, it was a great experience and it was truly nice. Thank you very much. We look forward to our next meeting, inshallah. And I wish you the best in the upcoming election. May Allah be with you, and I wish you the best.
Well, my career is coming to an end now, Mariam, and you and Aisha are about to embark on what I hope will be a glittering career of fearless reporting. And all I would say is enjoy it. Enjoy every minute of it, because life moves so quickly. But it is a great profession, and I hope that you do enjoy it, and don't be like me and rush into marriages. Pick wisely.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I was telling them before we joined, I think, the last segment, that if they could ask you to connect them to more and more journalists and experts that we can host together with them, that would be very much lovely.
Yes, I'll have a word with the editor of 5 Pillars, which is a Muslim online news service. And also they're always looking for good journalists to help them. So, and they pay as well.
That's great. We are looking forward to the connection, and we're looking forward to hosting them on the show, and any kind of collaboration and connection and working relationship with them is very much appreciated.
Yes, right. I'll send you an email and copy you into him.
All right. Thank you enormously.
Well, great to see you again, Omar, and I wish you all the best as well in everything that you're doing. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
You're welcome, ma'am. Always.
Okay. Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Aisha, say goodbye. You've muted yourself. Mariam, say goodbye.
Salam Aisha. Salam Mariam.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, ma'am.